Tennessee football team made a statement with defense in Norman, Oklahoma on Saturday and showed that Josh Heupel now can win in a variety of ways. He doesn't need just to win with offense. He can do it with this team with defense. Welcome into the Volunteer State. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside the Knoxville News Sentinels, Adam Sparks and John Adams. Guys, I thought Tennessee really showed on Saturday the maturation of a program, the maturation of a coach. Josh Heupel's won big games before, none bigger than the Alabama win a couple years ago. But this one was notable because he won a game in which Tennessee punted 8 times. He won a game in which they had a couple turnovers, won a game in which they scored 25 points because at some point during this game, Josh Heupel realized Oklahoma can't win this thing unless Tennessee serves it to him on a silver platter. Tennessee established a lead and then played ball control time of possession. What did you guys think of that approach? I know it caused a little alarm in the fan base that Heupel wasn't going for 45 points, but what was your perspective on it?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at how the only chance that Oklahoma had to win this game, they had early on. They sacked Nico, got a turnover. Sacked Nico again, got a turnover. Now, fortunately for Tennessee, their defense took it right back on the next play, but that was the only way that Oklahoma was going to have a shot to win the game if Tennessee gave it away. And I made this statement a few times in print this week, but when a game tells you how it can be won or lost, you should listen. And I think that's what Josh Heupel did. He looked at it and said, this game is telling me the only way that I'm going to lose it if I do a boneheaded, aggressive approach. If I do something out of pride, that's how I'm going to lose this game. And he swallowed his pride, went against his own instincts, and played it safe. And he won the game. I've heard a lot of a number of fans that have different theories on this week. One of my favorite ones was he was letting up because he didn't want to embarrass his alma mater. I'm not sure if the readers, if they thought that going into that game, because I don't think they read our reporting leading up to it. I actually have like sort of an opposite or alternate theory. I don't think Josh Heupel was looking out for Oklahoma at all. I think Josh Heupel was looking out for himself in an extreme way, as he should, as any coach should, because imagine if he had lost that game because of a decision he made out of hubris. That they lost that game and he left Norman with everybody in the country pointing to it and said, well, Josh Heupel blew that game, not his team, because he went for it too many times. He threw the ball when he didn't have to. He gave the game away. If that had happened, it would have been the ultimate embarrassment. So I think he looked at it and said, I just want to leave here with a win. And we heard that in the post game when he was asked, what was your best moment of this weekend? He said, just walking off the field with the win. I think he played it safe because he knew that's the way he could go home with a victory.
Yeah, I agree with you, Adam. And I was kind of surprised at the reaction of the fans. It's almost as though Josh Heupel is spoiled them by in his 3+ seasons there. Now, I would guess his point per game average is over 40 points now. So if you're not scoring 40 points, what's wrong with you? And also some of that is that Tennessee in the past has needed to score in big games. It's needed to score a lot of points. But as you pointed out, it didn't need that this time. The strength of Oklahoma was its defense. Whatever problems Oklahoma has on offense don't carry over to its defense. A lot of big-time players on that defense. You've got your 2 offensive tackles hurt in the second quarter. That's a really slow field, uncertain turf. So what could beat you? Turnovers, and you also got to think of a pass rush, which was gaining steam there in the second quarter. The last thing you need is to get Nico hurt, so your quarterback. So, yeah, I thought it was smart on Heupel's part, and I thought it was interesting that he wasn't even tempted when Nico hit a few big throws early on those deep slants, one for a touchdown, 66 yards to Dante Thornton. He hit Brew McCoy, same kind of play for a big gain. I mean, those were big plays and just big-time throws, but Heupel didn't yield to the temptation, stayed the course, won with defense. So kudos to him.
Yeah, I came away thinking a couple things, guys. One month into the season, I'm not feeling a lot of Heisman energy for Nico. I mean, maybe within the fan base, but the reality is you need stats to win a Heisman trophy, and I don't think Nico is going to have the stats, and that's not really a knock on him. It's just that Josh Heupel's teams win first and foremost with a run game. Now, Heupel is a great quarterback developer. Hendon Hooker had an excellent season 2 years ago. We know quarterbacks can put up big numbers and do put up good numbers with Heupel, but this team, I feel like it's run first. It's got a better defense than some past Heupel teams, and Nico doesn't need to go out and throw for 350 yards per game. So now things could change. Nico goes out and beats Alabama and Georgia, and Tennessee's 12-0. Well, then we might be having a different conversation about Nico and the Heisman, because we know that so much of that award comes down to big games and big moments. But I just don't know that they need him to play like a Heisman Trophy level to get to the playoffs. I think they're a more well-rounded team. So that's number one. But number two, I came away thinking this is a team that contend for a national championship. And I hadn't necessarily thought that the first few weeks of the season, certainly in the preseason. I looked at Tennessee as a playoff contender, but not necessarily a national championship contender. Now, after seeing how well this defense has played, and I know we got to add the caveat of how good were these offenses that they faced, but still, the defense is performing at a high level. Having seen that, I feel like they're a national championship contender. I do think there's two tiers of national championship contenders. Tier one is like Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, Texas. And then tier two probably has 3 or 4 other teams. But I think for me, Tennessee is on that tier two list of national championship contenders. I'm wondering if you guys would have them on your list, either tier one or if you have a tier two list of national championship contenders.
Yeah, tier one for me is Texas, Ohio State, and the winner of Saturday's game, Georgia, Alabama. The loser of that game, especially if the winner is Georgia, because it's in Tuscaloosa. The loser of that game probably is in tier two. Tennessee is in tier two. And yeah, there's a few others that they, I've said it before on here that I thought Tennessee would be a 9-3 at best 10-2 team. I've moved them up more to closer to an 11-1 type team now. The reason that I think we can say they're a national title contender to this point in the season is that the game we just saw, they can win in different ways. I don't know that they'll face a better defense than that this year. Georgia is certainly in the conversation. Alabama could be in the conversation, but Oklahoma's defense was close to as good as they're going to face. And Nico was still, when he did get chances, he threw the ball well. There was some similarities to that game and the Iowa game, the Citrus Bowl, where they figured out halfway through they didn't need Nico to do anything, just control the offense. And so he could have thrown for 300 in that game. They just didn't need it. When they lost their 2 offensive tackles, they had lost one early going into the game during the week. Lance Hurd, and then they lost the other one, John Campbell, during the game. They had 2 backup tackles. Oklahoma was crashing its safeties. In other words, they had a complex defense. I said that a week ago. Brent Venables is a phenomenal defensive coach. They have really good players. And the way that Tennessee runs its offense is you're basically counting players in the box, right? So you're going to throw it to the outside, or you're going to run it, depending on how many players are in the box. Well, at the snap of the ball, they were getting one look, and as soon as the ball was snapped, safeties were coming down hard. And so it made it hard for Nico, because what he was counting pre-snap was not the number he was getting a second after the snap. Oklahoma did a really good job of that. They were coming down, their safeties were coming down for run support. And so I say all that to say that Oklahoma was playing a defense that should stop the run, should stop Tennessee's run. And then Tennessee loses both tackles. They're keying on the run, and Tennessee still ran it well enough to win. If you can do that, do what a good defense knows you're going to do, and you're outmanned at a couple of spots because of injuries, and you still are able to run the ball and control the clock, I mean, that really says something. I think that defense is similar to what they'll see in Georgia and Alabama. I think they'll win in different ways, but that's one way they can do it. They did not play particularly well. I think that was probably a C- effort on offense, and they still moved the ball and scored points. And if they wanted to, they would have scored more. And so that's why they're a national title contender, because they can win with defense, they can win throwing the ball, they can win running the ball. And I just don't see a lot of soft spots on this roster as I thought maybe I would see to this point in the year. Really, the biggest soft spot I think right now are those injured tackles, because of how they can limit your offense, but also how you can get Nico hurt. And that's the way that Tennessee would not get to the playoff if Nico is hurt and if that offense is limited.
Yeah, I was a little bit higher on Tennessee going into the season maybe than you guys were, thinking 10-2 in a playoff bid. Now I'm going even higher. I think Tennessee and Texas are going to play for the SEC championship. I think those might be the two most complete teams. I know Alabama and Georgia have the tradition. They've been better lately, but I've watched those teams in all their games. And I think Tennessee, for one thing, it has a better defensive front than either one of them. And when was the last time you could say that? Georgia also has a really tough schedule. And I'm not sure if Ole Miss might not be ahead of those teams too. We'll see how it plays out. Ole Miss hadn't played anybody. But when I look at Ole Miss, Texas, and Tennessee, I put them in the same group. They have high-powered offenses that can score with anybody, and they also have good defensive personnel. So, yeah, I thought the Oklahoma game, I agree with you guys, that was a really good defense. And Tennessee won playing backup tackles for much of the game. I also think that is the Achilles heel if you're going to find one, and that's significant when you have to go below the first team to see what's wrong with the team. I think it's depth in the offensive line. I'm sure you could say that about a lot of teams, but right now I think Tennessee is really set in all areas: kicking game, punting, offense, defense. It's going to be really hard to beat if Tennessee stays healthy at quarterback and in the O-line.
John, making that prediction of Texas, Tennessee in the SEC title game, I see in your future, and maybe this has already happened, but I see in your future in your inbox questions about the SEC tiebreakers, because that's a lot of the conversation that I'm getting from fans. What if Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee each beat each other in a round robin, and they're all 11-1, and who goes? It would eventually go down to it's like the fourth or fifth line on the tiebreakers, like the combined winning percentage in conference of their opponents, basically strength of schedule. So I don't know how that would affect anything, but it puts a lot of weight, or potentially puts a lot of weight, on the Georgia-Alabama game Saturday, and probably Georgia's other games. Like you mentioned, they play Ole Miss, right? So maybe somebody in that bunch gets 2 losses, and we don't have to mess with tiebreakers.
Yeah, Georgia has to play Ole Miss and Texas. Yeah, sorry, Blake.
No, go ahead, John.
No, I was just saying Georgia has to play Ole Miss and Texas and Tennessee. It's a really much tougher schedule than what it had to go through to win back-to-back national titles in 21 and 22.
You made an interesting point, John, on our SEC Football Unfiltered podcast. You mentioned you think the game between Alabama and Georgia is actually the matchup between the SEC's 4th and 5th best teams. And you've already said here, you think Tennessee and Texas will play for the SEC championship. You think Ole Miss is the SEC's 3rd best team. So this big clash between number 1 and number 4 in Tuscaloosa on Saturday that Tennessee fans are going to be interested in, a couple of rivals that they'll face later in the season. You think it's the battle for 4th place in the SEC?
I mean, yeah. I know, Blake, but I mean, 5 teams could get in the playoff, or certainly 4 teams from this conference. So it's a huge game, and it's the biggest game thus far in the SEC season. And it's risky business when you're wondering about how good were the teams that Tennessee's beaten, how good are the teams that Ole Miss has beaten. When I just watch them, as far as with the eye test, I just see more playmakers with Ole Miss and Tennessee and Texas than I do with Alabama and Georgia. And I know Georgia struggled in the past against some lesser opponents, and it certainly struggled in Lexington before, but it never went down to the wire and won by one measly point against Kentucky and Lexington. I think that's kind of a red flag.
Adam, is it a battle for fourth place in Tuscaloosa?
Yes. Well, so that means that Tennessee doesn't play Texas or Ole Miss, so their schedule is even more favorable than we thought because they're not even playing the two top teams that they could be playing. They dodged everybody. They're playing middling Georgia and Alabama.
Guys,
I do think we can put to the side the whole conversation of like Tennessee's opponents to this point. You know, we looked at NC State. They blew out NC State. NC State ends up being a bad team. They beat Oklahoma by double digits on Oklahoma's home field. You say, well, Oklahoma's offense is bad. I think at some point you can look at the product of what Tennessee is, and the opponent doesn't matter all that much. Again, they won by 10 at Oklahoma. I think if you play that one 10 times, Tennessee probably wins it 9 times. And I think usually they win it by more than 10 because I thought that game they were about 3 touchdowns better than Oklahoma. And that's considering Oklahoma's defense played really well, played as well as it could. So I think looking at Tennessee compared to its opponents, I think that conversation is about over now. They're just a really, really well-rounded team.
Guys, I want to take the conversation in a different playoff direction next, but just a programming note for our loyal listeners. This will be my final week hosting the Volunteer State podcast. Podcast will continue in the capable hands of Adam and John after this week. I'm just moving into a different position with the company. Still writing columns. You can still find all my columns at KnoxNews.com, but we'll be moving from an SEC focused position into more of a national college football columnist position. Still going to be hosting SEC Football Unfiltered with John, and the Volunteer State podcast will continue with Adam and John each week. Just won't have to put up with me every week. So.
And Mike Wilson.
That's right.
Late breaking news. Mike Wilson he'll be hosting sometimes. I'll be hosting sometimes. We'll be a trio, some a duo, some, but Mike will also be on here.
John, are you shedding a tear? We've been podcasting together for 6 or 7 years on this pod. You ready to kick me out the door? I'm sure.
Well, no. In fact, though, since we're still doing SEC Unfiltered together, it's not. It's not like permanent separation. No, I won't have any separation anxiety. I'll just see you once a week instead of twice a week.
Yeah, my favorite episodes, John, a couple. One in 2020 when we randomly on this podcast kicked Vanderbilt out of the conference. Still one of the most listened to episodes of this pod of all time. Adam was covering Vanderbilt at that time, and it was during the pandemic. John and I were just kind of bored, and we thought, what's Vanderbilt doing in this conference? Let's kick him out. And who are we going to replace him with? So that was a good one. And then after the Lady Vols fired Holly Warlick, I don't know if you remember this, John, but they were kind of spinning their tires in the coaching search, and they wound up hiring Kelly Harper. But before they hired Kelly, and the coaching search was kind of going nowhere fast, you and I did a podcast headline, Why the Lady Vols Should Hire Holly Warlick as their next coach. And boy, fans just about lost their minds when they saw that headline, thinking, what are we doing here? They just fired Holly. Like, yeah, that's the point. Maybe Holly will be a better coach than the one that they end up hiring. And lo and behold, Holly was a better coach than the one they ended up hiring.
Did you guys know that I used to do a solo Vanderbilt podcast when I was at the Tennessean?
Boy, that is so brave. Let's take a closer look at that 42-7 loss Saturday.
Sometimes, thankfully, it was with Gentry Estes, our columnist at the Tennessean. But there was a good stretch there, and I forget why exactly it was, scheduling or something, but I had to do solo podcasts. We would do it in studio sometimes at the Tennessean in Nashville. And so I would have to go in and talk for like 40 minutes nonstop, no other voices, and just rattle off, okay, guys, so they lost by 4 touchdowns to South Carolina. Let's talk about it. So to have multiple voices on here and to have wins to talk about is certainly different.
All right, all right, guys. Let's wrap up with this because I think we've had some. Of course, it's the open date. That's why we're not really looking ahead here. But I think we've had some interesting dialogue as it pertains to the playoff and the conference pecking order and all this. So I want to close with this thought. I think there is a reasonable chance that the SEC finishes with 6 teams who are 10-2 or better. Doesn't mean all 6 will make the playoff. I think there's a reasonable chance they finish with 6 teams that are 10-2 or better. And I will suggest that these could be the 6. Alabama and Georgia, the teams that are 4th and 5th best in the conference, according to John. Tennessee, Texas, Ole Miss, and Missouri, I think could finish 10-2 or better. I had someone ask me recently, and I thought it was, at first I thought, oh, Tennessee's in if they're 10-2. But then the more I thought about it, I wonder, is there any risk to Tennessee if they were to finish 10-2, lose to Alabama and Georgia? Missouri's at 11-1, and the other playoff contending teams I mentioned are all 10-2 or better. So Alabama and Georgia beat Tennessee, finished 10-2 or better. Texas is 10-2 or better. Ole Miss is 10-2 or better. Missouri's 11-1. And Tennessee's 10-2 with losses to Alabama and Georgia. Point being that they'd be hanging their hat at that point on a resume that would probably be highlighted by a road win against Oklahoma, which may finish about 7-5 this season. Do you think they would be vulnerable at all in that scenario? Would the playoff, you think, just take 6 SEC teams, or do you think someone else in the SEC would be even more vulnerable than Tennessee?
Who is Ole Miss's best win and who is their loss to?
Let's say they beat Oklahoma and lose to Georgia and LSU.
Oof. So they're 10-2. So you're saying Missouri's
so let's say they're 10-2 with losses to LSU and Georgia and a win against Oklahoma.
I mean, then you probably got a coin flip. I don't think 6 are getting in. It would be 5 SECs. Yeah, Tennessee could. Here's the thing. We're judging it off of what we see of Tennessee now. If Tennessee were to lose to Alabama, still feeling okay because I think their product would still look playoff worthy. If they lose those games because the defense is not as good as we think it is now, if Nico is turning the ball over, if there's offensive line issues, basically if the product looks different than what we've seen so far, yeah, and Tennessee loses those 2 games in that scenario, then yes, I think Tennessee could feel nervous about it. I tend to think Missouri is going to trip up more than, I mean, they have a soft schedule, so they don't have to. There's not many opportunities for them to trip up. But I think they're an incomplete team at this point. So I think as long as Tennessee plays well like it has, I think it's going to be okay. But yeah, you're right. 10-2, there could be a whole lot of 10-2s. In that scenario that you laid out, I could see that happening. Tennessee needs to beat Alabama, and you don't have to mess with that. But we'll see. Yeah, there's still reasons to be nervous.
Yeah, when you look at Tennessee's non-conference schedule, it gets absolutely no help. And I don't know if the selection committee. This happens in basketball, where the selection committee, well, you made no effort to schedule really formidable opponents outside your league. And Tennessee, it looked like NC State might be a pretty good team. It was top 25 in preseason. Turns out it's not a good team at all. It might not even have a winning season from what I've seen of NC State. So that's really not solely Tennessee's fault. But the way it's played out now, I think it would be a little vulnerable. But I also think if it played Georgia and Alabama, I think those will be close games. I think if it loses, it will be close losses. Here's a scenario that would be troubling for Tennessee. If Missouri beat Alabama. See, if Missouri, and I don't think it will, but we're speaking hypothetically here. I think as Adam pointed out, Missouri is very vulnerable. It barely beat Vanderbilt. It beat Boston College by 6 points. It's going to lose to somebody that is a significant underdog, I think. It's just vulnerable. So I kind of eliminate it from the conversation. I don't think it's going to be a factor when you come down to the end of the season. I look at those other teams. Another factor in this, Tennessee's SEC opponents are really bad, some of them, outside Alabama and Georgia. I mean, you look at these teams, they're just kind of one-dimensional at best. I mean, they play – Mississippi State's probably the worst team in the league now. It's been better in past. So this schedule is pretty, it's fairly about as easy as you could get, I think. It plays Florida at home, and it'll be have a decided advantage anyway. I just think there's a real good chance Tennessee will go 11-1 now. But yeah, 10-2. And I wrote about this in preseason, the value of style points. When you're playing Mississippi State and Florida and maybe even Arkansas, it's okay to cut it close in Norman against Oklahoma. And as you said, it wasn't a 10-point game. It was more like a 2 to 3 touchdown game. But against these other teams, if you say Tennessee is clearly much better, and Tennessee has the ability to score a lot of points on an Arkansas or a Florida. And so maybe style points will matter at the end of the year if your scenario proves true, Blake.
Yeah, that was the style points was something I was going to bring up, because if you look at the schedule, Doc, there's pockets of these games where you can make the case every step of the way that Tennessee needs to run up the score if they have that opportunity. I mean, before Alabama is the Florida game at home. If you're up 17 going into the fourth quarter, you should make that 24. You should make that 31. If you get past, then you got Kentucky, Mississippi State, same thing. After the Georgia game, you'd say, well, then you kind of know where you stand. You're 10-2. You have 2 losses or 1 loss or no losses, so you sort of know where you stand. When you play, I mean, UTEP is different, but when you're at Vandy, like, you should try to hang 50 on Vandy. You shouldn't get out of there and just put it in the committee's hands. So I think that'll hold up. And anybody, I think, in any of these scenarios, I think where somebody says Josh Heupel needs to let up in some of these games, he has an easy counter, and that's this committee.
All right, guys, enjoyed hanging out with you. To the listeners, thanks for listening to me babble on all these years. Podcast continues next week with Adam, Mike, and John. You can still find me at SEC Football Unfiltered. And, of course, you can find all the coverage of the Vols. The most extensive coverage you will find of Tennessee football can always be found at KnoxNews.com. Thanks for listening.